So Levi, I think there'll be many listeners out there who could be forgiven for thinking they were listening to the original cello version of the Fauré Elegy, such is the elegance and finesse of your playing, and not a double bass transcription. Tell us a little bit about your family, first of all, because you had a musician mother, didn't you? And a psychiatrist father or psychologist?
Psychologist, yeah. I mean, that's very kind of you to say, by the way. And yeah, my mom is a musician. She mostly conducts now and teaches.
Okay.
She did have a career and still has a career of playing French horn as well. My dad says he plays the radio. And my sister is also a violinist. She's at the Menuhin school at the moment. And my brother has kind of off and on played cello, but not as seriously.
I mean, good genes in there somewhere. Okay, obvious question, why the double bass? I'm sure you get lots of jokes about people saying, wouldn't you rather play the oboe or piccolo?
Man, all the time.
So why the bass?
It's an interesting question. I didn't really pick the double bass. I guess when I was a kid, before I can remember, we had a family member who played jazz bass, and we went to one of their shows, and apparently I was obsessed when I was, really, really little. So when I was 10, my mom had me and my siblings pick an instrument, and I didn't really know what to pick, so it ended up being between double bass and bassoon, and because of the context of when I was a kid, my mom said, okay, you're going to play double bass, and I actually hated it for the first year, but after a year I joined an orchestra, and that's when I really started enjoying it and appreciating classical music a bit more.
Yeah. Did you listen to a lot of classical music? Was it in the house?
Yeah, I was definitely around it a lot growing up. I have to say, before I really started enjoying the bass, I wasn't very interested in classical music. I can't really say why, but I definitely started appreciating it more once I started playing.
So what was the soundtrack to your youth then? What kind of music were you?
Oh, everything. I mean, classical music definitely was around. I did enjoy it. I just didn't really grasp everything about it, I think, at the time. But, my dad listens to a lot of kind of 80s rock, classics, so I had a mix.
Yeah, I used to listen to an awful lot of prog rock when I was initially growing up, because it's very symphonic. So being in an orchestra, playing bass in an orchestra, I mean, you're the anchor of the orchestra, really, and God, there are some composers like Sibelius, for example, where the sound really does come up through the bass line. It's so that must have been a thrill, but were you also thinking at that time of the bass as a solo instrument?
Well, not really. I mean, it wasn't until I was about 14 that I really started taking it seriously. I mean, I really enjoyed playing the bass and music and everything, but it hadn't really crossed my mind as something that I could do, as a profession. But when I was 14, I did a couple competitions and had some success, and that was the first kind of moment where I realized, okay, this is something I can maybe do. And then at one of those competitions is where I met Caroline Emery, who I study with at the Royal College of Music, and she had invited me to study at the Menuhin School, or to apply for the Menuhin School when I was 14. It took a while, convincing my parents and for the whole application process and everything. And it was also right when COVID started. But I ended up going when I was 16, and was surrounded by a lot of amazing musicians, The people that come out of that school are absolutely crazy.
And were you aware then that, the repertoire for bass was extremely limited and needed expanding? And, at what point did you think to yourself, well, I could be the one to extend it even further? 'Cause I think every solo player thinks of themselves as wanting to expand the repertoire.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it wasn't something that was like, I flipped a switch and then all of a sudden, like, that's kind of what I wanted to do. It started just, hearing a piece that I thought could sound nice on the bass and trying and experimenting with things. And then, the more that progressed, the more I was like, okay, this is something that I can, do more of. Yeah.
In the meantime, you were at the back of the orchestra and enjoying being a part of that sound?
Yeah, I've always done a bit of everything. I haven't ever been exclusively a soloist or exclusively an orchestral player. I've been very fortunate to have a lot of experience with both of those things as well as chamber music. So it's been good to have the variety.
Now, the evolution of the instrument is interesting, isn't it? Because it's changed physically so much over the years. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that and bring us to the point where you talk about your own instrument.
Yeah, so I think the person who's attributed with kind of making the first thing that is irrevocably a double bass is Gefriller. Before that, it was kind of the viol, viola da gamba, different families that kind of came together to make this amalgamation of what is now the double bass.
So the two names which are always associated with it, Domenico Dragonetti and Giovanni Bottassini, tell us about their significance, because they both wrote soloistically for him.
Yeah, so they were definitely both kind of the virtuosos of their time. Dragonetti was very good friends with Beethoven, which kind of is one of the reasons I think that Beethoven wrote so idiomatically for the bass. And Beethoven was one of the first composers to really depart from just doubling the cello part and orchestral writing. And I think a lot of people attribute that to his relationship with Dragonetti. And Bottassini is kind of the same. He was very close with Verdi. He premiered several of his operas. He was also a conductor. And the story is that he would go and follow Verdi on his tours and play in the interval or before the opera a fantasy on solo bass based on whatever opera was being performed that evening.
It's interesting to me that these champions, as it were quite early. So why did the momentum falter as we move into, from the 19th into the 20th century, I guess? Why didn't Beethoven write a bass concerto? That's
a good question. I definitely think if there was going to be a major composer that, didn't write a concerto that should have, it would be Beethoven. Haydn did write a bass concerto, actually, but it was lost in a fire aside from the first two bars.
Do you think that part of the reason why it's been slow to evolve into a solo instrument more is because of the lack of repertoire? Is that the main reason?
I don't know. I think it's a kind of question of chicken or egg. It's definitely a newer instrument than, violin or cello, and because of its role in the orchestra, I think composers are, less prone to write in a solo context for the instrument. But I wouldn't say that it's kind of dropped off since, Dragonetti and Bottassini. There's been Gary Carr and now Edgar Meyer and, all these other fantastic soloists now that are kind of pushing the limits of the instrument. I think it's just kind of a matter of looking in the right places.
Yeah, and I guess like any repertoire, it's what is requested and demanded by the powers that be in various concert halls and orchestral managements and such like. One concerto that I'd like to hear is the Estonian Edward Tubin, because I really, really am very taken by his orchestral music, his symphonic music. Do you know that piece?
Yeah, that's one of I think it probably is my favorite bass concerto.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't performed it, but I've learned it, and I'm always looking for somewhere to perform it.
Oh, well, there's one example of, it is frustrating that orchestral managements, particularly with solo players, might be offered interesting pieces. It takes certain pieces so long to get into what I would call the core repertoire. Even famous composers like Leonard Bernstein, the Serenade. How long has that taken to become core repertoire, which it is now? So the Tubin, for example, tell me about it, because I must investigate. Presume there's a recording.
Yeah, there are several recordings. One of my colleagues, Will Dearden, just played it with the RCM Symphony Orchestra recently. But it's a very dark piece, as opposed to Bottassini, for example, that is very operatic and lyrical. I think Tubin brings a lot of the darker colors out very well, and technically it is a much more difficult piece in my opinion as well.
And I mentioned Mahler just now, and one of the most well-known solos for bass in symphonic music is the third movement of the First Symphony, the Frere Jacques movement. And what interests me about that is that he deliberately chose the bass because he wanted it to sound cadaverous and probably slightly ill-tuned. And yet players have got so sophisticated now that it sounds too beautiful most of the time. Do you see what I'm getting at? There's an evolution there that he uses as an effect more than as a solo instrument. What's your response to that?
I'm not sure really. I mean, it's obviously it's a funeral march and it should be dark, but I can't speak to whether the intention should be for it to be out of tune or not. I think that seems a little bit backwards, but I can't blame all
I
that.
think he had very little confidence that it would sound as beautiful as we now hear it. If you get, say, the principal bass of the Berlin Phil or something, it just sounds too beautiful.
Yeah.
The point is kind of missed. Can you articulate the challenges that the instrument presents soloistically for a player like you? I mean, talk about, tuning is one thing, agility, articulation. I mean, what are the particular challenges of that instrument as opposed to other string instruments?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind would be sort of intonation and just getting around the instrument, because obviously with a violin or a cello, the fingerboard is much smaller, so the room for error is much smaller. So with the bass, it's that much bigger, but we have to be that much more precise as well. So
that's what impressed me about that little clip of the Fauré.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Was just how intensely in tune it was. And how light it sounded by, when you expect this hefty beast, you expect a little awkwardness, and I certainly don't get that from you.
Oh, that means a lot.
I mean, it's a bit like taking an oil tanker around a Formula One course, isn't it? It's that kind of
that is
making those
analogy.
turns and corners. So those are the tuning and articulation, and because the pressure must be much greater that you have to exert on the string.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that kind of does even out, to a violinist or a cellist, in the sense that, the more we play with that pressure and build callus and everything, it does become something that isn't really as much of a concern. I mean, playing really high up on the fingerboard can be a bit of a challenge just because of, the amount of pressure it takes from certain body parts. I use the shoulder a lot more when I'm playing that high up, as opposed to if I'm playing, back in the neck, then there's a lot less pressure. But in terms of finger strength, it's less of a concern, at least for me.
What about bowing and bows? There are different techniques at work. I've watched orchestras from all around the world, and they hold their bows differently. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I play what's called the German bow, which is the underhand hold. French bow is the alternative, which is the same hold that violinists or cellists use.
So, rather than this very night.
But one isn't really better than another. It's preference. German bow is slightly longer and it's a little bit easier to play off the string, and as opposed to French bow, which I don't play French bow, but people say it's a bit easier to sustain sound. So it's kind of pick your poison, but they both do everything at the end of the day.
Right. And creating repertoire. I mean, this is the key question, isn't it? Expanding and creating repertoire. I mean, how do you go about this? I mean, is it a case of you mix with other bass players, obviously, and you mix with composers and such like? I mean, how do you go about creating? I mean, other than transcriptions, which, to be honest, is a perilous field.
It is, yeah. No, it's tricky. I mean, it does take a lot of experimenting, and not everything works as much as I would like it to. But in terms of getting new works, I think the best thing that me or any other bassist can do is just keep playing to people, keep putting the double bass out there as a solo instrument, because I think the more composers and just generally the public kind of are aware of the bass, I think the more likely new commissions will be.
Yeah, because they'll see what's achievable on it, and that in itself is is an attraction for composers. With regard to transcriptions, I mean, are there concertos, for example, for cello and, particularly for cello? I'm thinking of things like the two Shostakovich concertos. Might they be viable for the double bass?
That's where I'm probably not so convinced yet. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question that can only be answered if it's tried. So I haven't tried it yet. I haven't heard anybody try it. So I might be proven wrong, but that would cross my mind as something to be careful of.
But it could be technically possible.
Yeah.
In which case, that would throw the field wide open.
Yeah.
Because you would then be, instruments almost interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with double bass right now is that there's a lot of different tunings as well that, people can play kind of absurd repertoire for the double bass, like Shostakovich.
So give us an example of when you say tunings, so tuning the strings differently.
Yeah, so it's sort of scordatura. What I play in is called solo tuning. It's basically the strings are a tone higher than the normal orchestral tuning, which gives a brighter and more projected sound for solo playing. And nowadays there's even higher tunings, like up an entire fourth. So there's a really bright sound. I mean, I think that kind of, in a historical performance context, for Bach and things, I think it's a bit more appropriate, because it's similar to viola da gamba or the viol or, the kind of historical context to the double bass. But I'm not so convinced personally to use it with modern repertoire unless it's something commissioned for that tuning. I think it's a little bit of a cop-out, to be honest.
And what is the music that really rings your bell, in a way? What do you love to play, regardless of availability of rep? Which composers, which period appeals the most?
Definitely romantic. I mean, I'm having a lot of fun exploring Schumann at the moment, but I mean, I love playing a lot of different genres and time periods, but I think romantic is the one that's kind of closest to my heart.
Schumann's an interesting case in point. I mean, to me, there's always a sense of the improvisatory about his music. It's this lyricism that just spins.
Yeah.
In almost every piece, and I think he's still a very underrated composer. It's for all his fame, he doesn't have the kind of status that Schubert, Beethoven have, and of course it's more into the Romantic era. You listen to the Second Symphony, for example, and the slow movement could almost be early Mahler. It's so lushly romantic.
Yeah, no, I really do enjoy Schumann a lot.
Yeah, and so what's available in his repertoire for you to play?
Well, the pieces that I'm most familiar with are the 5 pieces in folk style, but I'm also exploring,
which is a cello piece originally.
Yeah. But I'm also exploring the 3 romances for oboe and piano. And I'm hoping to get around to Fantasie as well, and I'm also looking at the Clara Schumann romances. So there's quite a bit of Schumann at the moment. Okay.
How far are you prepared to go? I mean, we were talking earlier about players who extend their rep into very contemporary music, even pop music, and adapt it for the instrument. Does that appeal at all?
Not really.
No.
I mean, I don't want to speak on what the future may or may not hold, but at the moment, I think I'll stay in the rabbit hole of classical music.
Isn't it interesting, though, that the bass is very much a solo player in jazz? for example.
Yeah.
Admittedly, it's mainly pizzicato rather than bowed contributions, but it's accepted as, a primary solo player in a way that it isn't in the classical repertoire. So you've got a lot of a challenge ahead to do that. So what about programming? When you, for example, put together you're doing a Wigmore Hall program, who are you playing with on that occasion?
So for that concert, it's not a full recital. I'm just playing with Oscar Kaya, who's a cellist at the RCM as well, and we were both at the Menuhin School together as well. So it's kind of a
so you're contributing to a wider concert. But if you were putting together your own program for your own solo recital, what would you be inclined to include?
Well, it's a tricky question. I like to think very carefully about programs because I think it's important to make sure that they're varied and not just all Schumann, for example. I love Schumann, but I wouldn't program something that's just completely Schumann.
Yeah. It's a real art program.
Yeah, no, it's challenging, but I do enjoy crafting different programs and then performing them and seeing what works, what audiences enjoy, what I enjoy.
And do you see your career splitting between, in an ideal world, would you like to be completely a solo player and chamber player, or could you see yourself being part of an orchestra, a major orchestra, and then doing the other work on the side, as it were?
Well, at the moment, I'm definitely most passionate about solo and chamber music. If I can do a lot of that in my career, I'll certainly be happy. But I think it's also a bit inevitable to play orchestrally as well. Not that I dislike orchestra at all, but I think a bit of everything, teaching as well.
Yes, now that's an interesting field. Would you say the instrument is evolving into a more popular choice now for music students?
It's interesting. It seems like the double bass is a lot more popular in places like Korea, for example. There's definitely more opportunity now for young people to start playing the bass at a younger age.
Why is that, do you think? Why is it,
I think
why does it differ internationally?
I think, I'm not sure about the difference internationally, between different countries, but in terms of, younger ages being able to start the bass, I think it's mostly because of the type of instruments that are available. Now there are instruments being made that are a lot smaller and manageable for young kids. It's not a small instrument, so I think typically around 10 is kind of when most people start.
Okay. So that's interesting. Do you think there might come a time where, as a solo instrument, the bass might completely alter its shape again and become smaller, so it can get around a wider rep?
It's a good question, and I wouldn't be surprised either way, to be honest. I think it depends a lot on the individual. I know, for example, people like Edgar Meyer or Roman Patkolo, they do play on smaller instruments, but I think it just depends on the individual and the instrument that they have available to them and their preference as well. I'm a pretty big guy, so I think a half-size double bass probably wouldn't fit my playing as well as a full size. Yeah,
well, that's a consideration too, of course. One's physical being, and these are things I haven't thought about greatly because it still retains a certain mystique. As a solo instrument. As an orchestral instrument, we just feel its presence all the time, and that's exciting. How often do you play with orchestras these days? Or
It depends. I mean, most of the playing that I do at the moment, because I'm still a student, is with the RCM. So at the beginning of each term, they'll kind of program a couple projects. So it depends on what I get put in. This term, because of Wigmore, I haven't been involved as much, but previously, 2 or 3 orchestral projects a term is kind of what I would expect.
One forgets how young you are. 21?
In about a week, yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, it's good to talk to you, and I hope, I've seen over my career, I've seen the repertoire grow enormously. And even cello players like Rostropovich, I mean, how many works did he add to the repertoire? Enormous, because everybody wanted to write for him. I guess that's the ambition, isn't it?
Yeah,
just
definitely.
Inspire people to, well, I wish you well with it.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.